All right, so I want to just start the panel with a basic premise. That is that learning poverty is just as detrimental as monetary poverty, which many experts are using lots of very fancy quantitative measures to tell you is true. Learning poverty, in the way defined, is being unable to read and understand a simple text by age 10. And basically all this means is that poorer children are more likely to be learning poor. If they are more likely to be learning poor, they have less economic opportunities, social opportunities, political opportunities, and are limited in the way that monetary poverty would do so. So what does that tell us? In addition to foundational literacy and numeracy limiting quality educational outcomes, we know there's a link between foundational literacy and the health of the education system. In addition to that, we know that there's a link between foundational literacy and numeracy and the economic growth of a nation, the economic health of a nation. But we go further than that, and we say that there's an issue around wealth inequality, and we want to be able to alleviate that as well. So it's not just about economic growth and growing the GDP and various other economic indicators, but also our ability to close the gap on wealth inequality. So since this conference is about the Indian economy, if we look at India, we start to look more closely at foundational literacy. In India, we find 55% of late primary age children suffering from learning poverty. And if we go looking at the COVID pandemic years, there's estimates that 92% of children were losing some sort of reading ability during that period. So we've reversed some of our progress in this area. We have a lot to catch up on. So the IFC report that we were just talking about has language as an instrument to fight against poverty in the new education policy. And I just want to give us a little bit of context and start by understanding what is needed for children to have a comprehensive literacy experience. So to begin with, we recognize literacy is actually a pretty amazing human feat, right? We learn to read text, and at the same time, we're making meaning while we're reading text. So there's this balance between fluency and comprehension. As I become more fluent, I'm going to comprehend more. As I comprehend more, I'm going to become more fluent. And that balance is necessary as you're teaching a child to read. So the ability to make meaning is a function of increased fluency, but the opposite is also true. Reading with fluency, that's your speed, your accuracy, your ability to have the right expressions as you're reading, are a function of increased comprehension. So we're looking to build that balance in curriculum that we're developing. So in this area of what children need, particularly in the Indian context, the most obvious hurdle is that children in India need to learn in a language that they're familiar with in their early years. And so orality, the link between home language and language in the classroom, is really important. Secondly, the child needs exposure to language materials that they're familiar with. And the most obvious hurdle then is that children in India are not equally prepared for school. Pre-literacy skills may not be being built at the same levels in their home because there may not be print at home, or you may have low literacy levels at home. So what does a structured pedagogical approach look like? I've just got a slide up here to give you a sense of some of the components. And for many of the practitioners who are building programs in this space, this is sort of what we're looking at to structure pedagogy in our programs. And that includes the scope and sequence of the language and being able to learn letters, words, sentences in parallel. So am I able to teach the child the most commonly used consonant-vowel combinations quickly so they can start building words quickly, building sentences quickly, et cetera. The importance of lesson plans and teacher guides that are very practical for teachers, that are not using a lot of jargon, that help a teacher build very effective, simple engagement with her students on a regular basis. Coaching, not just professional development, but on-site coaching. So having state governments have cadres of mentors for teachers. And of course, data systems, monitoring systems, et cetera, which a report like this one tells us a lot about the importance of those types of measures. The other nuances in the Indian context, I think important for us to keep in mind as we're thinking through the complexities. Because Indian languages are akshara-based scripts, the automaticity is required at both the akshara and the text level. So you've got 400 or so consonant-vowel combinations, right, that you're expecting children to decode as they're reading. So as you're developing curriculum, the awareness, phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension have to be split out into lessons that are paced appropriately, but don't overload children. Of course, there's also the shortage of dedicated FLN teachers, and that's an issue that we have to focus on to ensure that the trainings are effective, specifically in the context of India, where we have multi-grade, multi-language classrooms. Quality reading materials, a dearth of those in local languages, but it's important to not just be creating them. You need procurement systems, distribution systems to get these materials out across the states and countries at scale. We talked about the importance of learning in a familiar language first, but parents and communities also need to be made aware that young children who acquire strong foundational literacy skills in their home language will be able to learn other languages, English included, better, faster in the future. So despite these various challenges, lots of challenges, there has been quite a lot of progress and successful interventions in foundational literacy, many by NGOs, but at limited scale. But we are seeing some very strong examples of going to scale when we're able to work with government systems and we have the leadership we need from the government system to scale up. And I just have one quick example from our work that is also highlighted in the IFC report. So since 2015, Room to Read has been implementing a project known as the Scaling Up Early Reading Intervention, which is supported by USAID. And it's a large-scale, comprehensive early grade literacy project. It started across 4 states, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and Uttar Pradesh, reaching 300,000 children across 2,600 primary schools. We've just added 2 more states this past year, Telangana and Rajasthan. And the key components under the project are explicit reading and writing instruction, reading material that focuses on that balance between fluency and comprehension that I mentioned, child-friendly libraries with regular reading activities, dedicated time for reading instruction. Time built in for practice is incredibly important as children are learning to read, and teacher training, as well as monitoring and assessment. And the program is designed with an I do, we do, you do approach that mirrors the way we want teachers to work with students. So in the I do model, Room to Read is demonstrating the program. In the we do model, we're working directly with the state government, releasing some responsibility into the system. And then finally, with the you do model, the state government is implementing completely on its own with our technical assistance and support. And the first 2 phases have been completed. We're in the midst of the third. But you see the results are quite promising. So we had an evaluation of the demonstration phase conducted in 2015 to 2017 in Chhattisgarh and Uttarakhand, and then an evaluation of the partnership phase between 2016 and 2018. And in both cases, we had effect sizes between 1.3 and 1.5 standard deviations, which is quite considerably substantial for these types of projects, and basically translates to fluency rates in program schools that are 2 times that of comparison schools. So now the time is right. There's an enabling environment due to the National Education Policy and Nipun Bharat to make transformational changes. And of course, additional budget allocations being made in this area to continue to support that. So we'll now have this opportunity to work together, all of us as stakeholders, to keep the momentum going. And that's what we're going to hear more about during the course of this panel. And in the context of the Foundation Literacy and Numeracy report being released by the IFC, and supported by USAID and Room to Read, we'll get to hear some insights from practitioners who've been working in education, like Arundhati from Mentor Together, from Karen, who is working with USAID, and they've invested quite a lot in literacy initiatives all over the world, And of course, from Pavanji, who has tremendous experience conceptualizing, managing, and implementing projects, and from Asha, who's been working in the education space for a considerable number of years in India. So you'll have this opportunity to hear their insights, and hopefully we'll keep the momentum going around education. So with that, we're going to start talking with our panelists here. All right, so Asha, you're mic'd, right? Okay. Maybe you can start just by telling us a little bit about your experience in education, and just given some of the themes we're talking about today, where do you think that we as a collective community should be focusing to continue to make improvements?
So I think my first sort of adventure in education, I'm actually a venture capitalist and now a philanthropist. We run a family foundation that is focused on entrepreneurship, bringing entrepreneurship into disadvantaged areas where there aren't. My first dabbling in kind of seeing how we could accelerate kids who are problem solving in their community was we hosted something called the Maker Festival in India, and we had thousands of people showing up from across the country, young people from anywhere from age 6 to 25. And we would pick out of those, we would pick about 20 people, bring them to Silicon Valley and accelerate whatever they were doing. But that was, I mean, I see that as part of their own learning journey and how we could not just accelerate the projects they were working on, but also enable them to think about learning in a different manner. We had a lot of kids that did drop out of high school and do successful projects and actually create livelihood out of that. So this was very promising for me. But my first real adventure in sort of learning, as you guys are speaking about it, is on School in the Cloud. And I had worked with Professor Sugata Mitra, who was a TED Prize winner at TED. He had worked on, those of you who are in India, you probably know about Professor Mitra's work called Hole in the Wall, which he had, where he had put a computer in the concrete while it was still setting under a freeway in I think in New Delhi. And the kids were just, I mean, children of the construction workers who were playing around there were playing with this computer. And they taped all this, and they discovered that in a year, the kids learned how to do search on their own. They learned English, and there was just phenomenal results achieved by simply having this computer, with access to this computer. So out of that, Professor Mitra had actually developed something called School in the Cloud, which I also adopted. And we got this sort of the internet we put in a 2 terabyte box. And we deployed it actually in pretty terror-ridden parts of Pakistan, because I wanted to bring that kind of education and just learning, actually. So we had the internet in a box in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and some of those regions where there was a lot of I would say a lot of power of the clergy. And I was surprised to see that the clergy was quite happy to have this box that we were saying. And we were working with a group in Karachi called Spotcom. It was a local ISP. So because it was easy for us to then deploy it in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But what we learned is that irrespective of whether this was in India or Pakistan or wherever, if kids had access to the internet, even if they didn't know English, actually it made a lot of difference without having teachers who knew English. So these are all pretty radical, disruptive learnings from this project and this experiment that Sugata did. They have data for all this. It's all, if you look at School in the Cloud, it's all there. And there's something called the Soul Kit, SOLE, Soul Kit, that one can download from TED.com, which gives you the whole template on how to do this on your own. And we had another one set up in Ahmedabad in an all-girls school. The results were phenomenal. Kids learned English and math in a way in which we had never expected. So I think that was my first experience. And I'm a believer in this whole idea of kind of privatizing and decentralizing learning through the edge nodes. It doesn't have to be centralized. And how does one make this happen? There are tons of NGOs in India, literally thousands of NGOs now, that actually go into the slum. And they enable learning in the children's environment where they are. So they don't have to be going to specific construction sites and so on. So the results are phenomenal. How this can be scaled and systematized, I don't know. But
that's the big question. I think it in the report, and Amit, you can correct me if I'm wrong in quoting this, but I think it's like 40% of schools have computers and only 25% are on the internet. in India. So if that's the case, this digital divide is an interesting question, right, in terms of where the governments are going to go in terms of their own investments in technology and public systems. And we can talk a little bit about that. And then I think there's a lot of learnings out of the pandemic period as well, with the use of low-tech interventions like the radio and television and other things like that to get to the margins, as you say. So maybe with that, Aditi, I know you have some experience working with a number of age ranges, and maybe you can just share a little bit about your work first and tell us some of your reflections on what you've heard so far.
Sure. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and congratulations to Richard and Amit for putting together such an eclectic group and also a day of so much insight. I'm Arundhati Gupta. I'm a social entrepreneur. I'm based in Bangalore, but I've also recently started spending more time in the Bay Area. I co-founded Mentor Together, which is a youth mentorship nonprofit organization that works across India. If I can bring up the slides, I have 3 ideas to share from my work at Mentor Together to this very, very important topic of foundational learning. So just moving ahead, I think it's with me. So a lot of our work at Mentor Together as a mentorship organization is on this very, very simple premise that every aspect of human development is fundamentally shaped by interpersonal relationships. The people who we have around us, the people who we know, the kind of nurture they provide us, the kind of guidance, the inspiration, sometimes even consoling us in difficult times, those types of relationships become so vital in all our lives, so consequential in many ways in terms of what we do in our lives. And especially for young people who come from backgrounds of social or economic disadvantage, they can often be the differentiator between whether someone gets the right information and advice or gets the right support when they really need it. So building on this idea of mentorship and how our work has really looked at ensuring that mentorship is central to the education experience. We don't see it as very different from formal learning. We see that it's something that young people have to be supported through. And just as a little bit of context before I move on, in the last 4 years, a lot of our work has taken on a digital shape in looking at mentorship through an entirely digital program for young women and men in universities. So we work with over 3 state governments. We've developed a digital mentoring platform. We have over 35,000 mentors and mentees on it. So I'll speak to some of my learnings from that. That could be 3 ideas from all of my work that I think could be helpful for this topic of foundational learning. So the first one is just the opportunity when we think of foundational learning for us to set it as the base and the starting point for gender transformative education. And why is that so important? Right? Research shows that children start gaining insight into cultural gender stereotypes from as early as ages 2 and 3. They can start demonstrating behavior that's then stereotyped or prejudiced from as early as age 3 or 4. In our work in tertiary, and these things that start this early only get more entrenched as age goes on. In our work in tertiary education today, the number one challenge that we're trying to solve is that why are there equal numbers of young women in universities, but only 30% of them go on to work, which is a problem that we discussed. Rohini shared a lot about it in two panels before. And we realized that you can solve for a skills deficit, you can address a network gap, but the hardest thing to change have been gender norms and social norms, which kick in so much in India to say that after the age of 18 or 21, the role of a woman primarily becomes that of a provider, of someone who should look at her family and the needs of the family rather than be economically providing. And so I asked myself that imagine if we could start solving that problem when young people, when they were children, when they were 2 or 3, right? The length of time we have to actually set the right gender norms and ensure that then those things don't become something that we're trying to just through other ways solve. So I think that's the first idea I'd like to share, that foundational learning is really the place where we have to start gender transformative education. And what that means is often moving from curricula and there's a continuum of educational pedagogy when you think of gender transformative of education, and you can start from being gender blind to gender neutral to gender sensitive, but what you need to be is gender responsive, which means that you don't have to, a lot of educational curricula is not stereotyped or does not have bias or prejudice in it. But what it means is that today, knowing what's the situation in India, it has to very actively address what's happening. It has to, so I recall an anecdote which if you take a book from, if you take one of the early education textbooks, there's a really nice story of a boy who's peeling peas and helping his mom in the kitchen. Now that's a great way to be gender sensitive because you're not showing the girl in the kitchen. But to take it further, why should it be the woman in the kitchen? Why is his mother in the kitchen? Why can't it be showing that the role of a man is also in the kitchen, right? So in those ways, making sure that you're really thinking of how to tackle some of these inequalities that emerge in India's society through early learning. The second idea that I'd like to share, and this comes from work, sometimes I feel I run a technology company and sometimes I feel I run a not-for-profit because we've ended up building so much of mentoring technology for us to use. And I think technology in education has seen a rapid increase, especially because of school closures during COVID and what that meant. And like Geeta mentioned, it was also a lot of TV and also a lot of radio, but a lot of apps, a lot of different types of interventions have come up. If I could add what I think, and technology can do so many things, right? You could be putting teaching learning material onto it. You could be putting more types of training for teachers itself. The one thing that we've learned is most important, if you could address through technology, is this idea of helping the helper. So what's called in digital health and mental health interventions as supportive accountability. The fact that the person on the front line, often in India, in early education, the Anganwadi teacher, right? Or a parent who's coming from a low-resourced environment, doesn't really know what to do, but has to provide that care for their child. They don't often have the skills and the knowledge to do the right thing at the right time. So if technology can provide those kinds of very paired support to ensure that the person on the ground has that, it's almost like a buddy, it's almost like a coach. And interventions that do that have found to have much greater effect than if the helper is left with technology and left to figure it out on their own. So I think the idea of supportive accountability and coaching and nudging the person on the ground through technology is what I'd hope is an idea we take ahead and really scale. And for us in mentoring, it has meant some fairly low-tech things, like you've said, Geeta. Everything is not an app. We've had to create, for every mentor-mentee group, a WhatsApp group, because that's the way, and India runs on WhatsApp, everyone knows that. That's the way we can actually get real-time information to help the mentor make the right decisions when they're mentoring. So imagine if we could do that for the Anganwadi teacher or a parent. That's the second idea I would put forward. And then the final idea that I put forward, because I really enjoyed reading through the report, the very multi-stakeholder approach that is there to early education today, including in the national education policy. It envisages a big role for business and government and civil society. From the business side, like it was mentioned, India has a very, very interesting corporate social responsibility law that mandates 2% of net profits being spent. And in the 7 years that it's been there, over ₹1 trillion has been put into the development sector because of that. So we have a lot of funding coming from the business side. What I found very helpful in my work at Mentor Together is taking a very shared value approach to working with business. Don't just take the money from them, but really think how this problem relates to their problem and what they need to do for that. A statistic I use very frequently with business leaders when I speak to them is this statistic from the Energy Project, which says that only 36% of workers worldwide find meaning and significance in their work. So they're looking for opportunities to do more than just what their work entails. And can businesses look at that opportunity to give their employees a chance to sit a seat at the table for important issues for India? So we look at the opportunity to build leadership, sensitivity, empathy through volunteering. And I think that's also one key idea that is there in early education. The Vidyanjali project, which is trying to ensure that schools are actively connected to volunteers. And I'd say that's something we've seen incredible success with Mentor Together's initiatives. We work with over 40 companies to ensure that, and this is in the context of tertiary education, but I can easily see it being also done in early education, but to really say that this is investment you're doing in your own human capital that you're going to see, whether it's 3 years down the line or 20 years down the line, So how do you start actively getting yourself and your human capital, which is your employees, involved in solving this issue from day one? Yes, those are 3 ideas I'd like to share.
Those are wonderful, thank you. If you can actually pass over to Karen, I think your slides are in there next. So maybe you can chat a little bit about USAID and sort of the portfolio that you've had. I know that you've invested quite heavily in literacy projects all over the world, in India as well, and something like 24 million children, I believe, just in 2020 alone across 50 countries benefiting from projects that have been supported by USAID. Just given some of the themes you've heard, what are you all seeing in your portfolio? What do you think for this audience, as we kind of look to the future, we should be focused on?
Great, thank you, Geeta. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I am Karen Klimowski, and I'm with the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. I've been working in international development for over 30 years in a variety of sectors, from public health to renewable energy to democracy and governance to education, a jack of all trades in international development. And we value our partnership with the government of India, with organizations like Room to Read, with Institute of Sustainable Competitiveness, Institute for Competitiveness. It's what makes us successful. I think as we sat through all of the lessons, what we heard today, we can all agree that numeracy and literacy is a foundation. And teaching the younger kids the basic skills so that they can succeed throughout their school year and then turn into the workforce is one of the most important things that we can do. We at USAID India, we really work closely to support India's national education policy, the Nipun Bharat. And we're partnering with the government and organizations like Room to Read to do curriculum development, teacher training. We set up libraries in local schools in local languages for students to learn. One of the unintended consequences of COVID is we also drew parents into the library. So parents that weren't previously reading saw their kids checking out books and reading them at home when the school was disrupted, and they started reading and they started learning, and they were able to learn to read. We engage parents to support their children's learning and build the capacity of the management committees, and also increasing local government body support for education. We look at a holistic approach to improve the reading outcomes and really create that foundation for the basic numeracy and literacy. So development organizations and the US government, we have a few lessons learned that we've learned not only in India, but implementing our education programs throughout the world. First, we recognize that it's really important to partner together and to bring together a broad array of partners. We at USAID do not have all the answers, and far from it. So we work with organizations, NGOs, mentors together. We work with government bodies. We work at academia to do reports such as the one that we released today. And that's really to help us develop a common understanding and to reach those shared goals and to create better programs and to adapt those programs as we move forward so we can take from the research reports that we have, adapt it, and implement better programs. We, as USAID and the US government, can play a catalytic role in convening these partners. As the US government, we're able to speak with the Indian government, coordinate closely with them, and introduce partners that haven't traditionally worked together to come into the space and create leverage more power into numeracy and literacy. We also must focus on sustainable impact. How do we make these programs more meaningful and sustained over the long term? How do we create a system where students will stay in school, where they're excited to learn, they're given an environment where they want to learn and they want to continue their education, and where we break down norms and barriers so if their parents or they support the children's learning and they see the reason for it and moving it into the future. We are working on policy development, working with states to develop vision and joint action plans to implement and monitor foundational learning and numeracy programs. And I think the systems level approach really fosters more consistent and effective outcomes throughout the states. We are also working the report will show different states achieving different areas. So we're looking at how do we take the best practices, creating a community of best practices. How do we take the best practices from one state and bring them to another state to be implemented and to tested in that state so we can have greater development outcomes. We also at USAID look at inclusive and locally led development approach. So we're rooted in the belief that every person is instrumental in transforming their societies. And we must look at communities to look at solutions and help develop those solutions. We prize the knowledge of people in those communities, respect their expertise, and engage them as partners rather than beneficiaries. For education, that can mean ensuring that innovative learning materials and programs are available in multiple languages through a wide variety of accessible platforms and focused towards communities and groups. We also feel it's very important of inclusion, to talk about inclusion. We heard about it today, women in the workforce. We've heard about it in the panel. You just spoke highly about it. And through all of our programs, we take special care to expand access to education for women and girls. And looking at materials that are gender neutral or gender transformative, that start breaking down those gender norms and the barriers to accessing education. And I'll just share a couple of stories. I recently went to Uttarakhand, and I was able to visit one of our programs that we're implementing with Room to Read there. And I met a young student named Rita. And she was telling me that she was terrified to go to school. Her older sister had a horrible experience in school, was berated, she wasn't learning. She came home crying every day from being in the classroom. So Rita didn't want to go to school at all. And luckily, she got into school. She went to a school that we had been working in with Room to Read, where we had done teacher training programs, we had done professional development. We created one of the reading libraries there where they had the access to read and they had dedicated times to read. And Rita saw the books. She started getting really involved in the books. She loved the books. She loved the colorful of the books. She brought the books home. Her mother started reading. Her father started reading. She was teaching them to read, as they also weren't reading. And it really sparked her curiosity. And she told me when I met her, she's become a star reader in the top of her class. And in her own words, she said, "I love coming to school every day. My teachers help me learn in a very fun way. I want to become a teacher like them one day so I can help others in reading and learning." And for us, that's part of why we do our work. While this is just one story, we can extrapolate it and bring it across and know that it's applied throughout all the areas where we work. And just another example I want to bring in, which is tied to some of the earlier panels that we're working on. We are working in micro and small enterprise development in India as well. And I had the opportunity to travel to Madurai and Tamil Nadu recently, and then drove to Kerala from there. And in that trip, I visited a women's cooperative that we've established with over 6,800 women. And these women are from the tribal communities, had always worked in the informal sector. We've partnered with a group called Industry, which is based in Bengaluru. And then we've created, these women all own this business now. And what they're doing is harvesting banana bark and bamboo fiber, all the way from planting the fields, growing the bamboo trees, growing the banana trees, harvesting the bark, drying the bark, processing the bark, turning it into rope, and now making it into products. And while we do that kind of skilling all the time, sometimes what we lack is creating a market for the product. So we were able to create a market to IKEA, Carrefour, Target. We're in talks with Walmart. And these 6,800 women have sold over $2 million worth of products to IKEA in the last year. And now, why is this important? When I met with the women, they all talked. We also started bringing in gender-based violence training and gender training to them. they all started talking to me about how their husbands were not supportive of them working in the workforce. Now their husbands, most of them, who were also in the informal sector, have quit their jobs to support their wives. Their wives are working less than 8 hours a day and actually went from making about 2,000 rupees a month to 25,000 rupees a month, and working from 16-hour days to now about 6-hour days. They've taken that money and putting the money into their children's education. They all talked about how important their children's education was and how they have both their girl child and their boy child now working doing household chores, which in the past had never happened, and they would keep their girl child from school. So when we talk about a holistic approach, I think these are extremely important as well, to create those opportunities and start breaking down the gender norms from the parents down to the kids as well. So with that, I will leave it, and I will say that some of the work we're doing in India and with the government, I think, is really innovative and can serve as models that we can replicate and take to other countries in the world as well, particularly in African countries where there's a lot more to do in numeracy and literacy. So thank you.
It's fascinating that development agencies have been moving towards system strengthening more broadly, and you made the point around local ownership, and with that, I think it's sort of the right moment to invite now Pavanji to address all of you. You're representing, systems that are serving 250 million children, 1.5 million public schools, and the Economic Advisory Council of the PM's office. And so I'll invite you just to share a little bit about your thoughts, particularly given the complexity and the state structure around education and sort of what the scorecard means and what do we do with all this information?
So, good evening, everyone. My presentation is based on this report only, and I will be going through this presentation on the basis of the school, teacher, and child. Basically, I will be talking about the major challenges and way forward. So, how to improve access to school education. Importance of education is for economic growth, social justice, equality, scientific advancement, national integration, and culture preservation. That was, but requirement of a school in future, as Vivek sir mentioned during his conversation, that we will be having less school in future. You can see the largest share of age 5-24 in India 2011, but in 2036, this percentage of total population shift to 2044. So major challenges related to access is improvement of SDI index, gross enrollment ratio, annual dropout rate, retention rate, which Arundhati was also mentioned. Total number of children in 3 to 9 years, you can say you were talking about the Anganwadis, but number of children not enrolled is can be seen here in pre-primary enrollment and enrollment in grade 1, 2, 3. Still we have large number to check. And the most important, accessibility of children with the special need, that is also declining in enrollment of children with in states marks or numbers can be seen also. So future trend is, as mentioned in morning session also, the share of India's 0 to 19 population on decline, and overall number of school-going children will decline by 18.4% between 2011 to 2041. And nations like Japan, China, South Korea, Singapore, Canada, with similar trends have already begun. So now the major issue with this new education policy is that we should bring back all out-of-school children, prevent dropouts, achieve 100% GR at all levels, and all the state and UT government to innovatively group or rationalize schools. That is the main motto, and these are the innovative practices from states. Like Bihar is talking about Pravetsav, jisme in that scheme they are through street play, Prabhat Ferries, they are encouraging students to come. J&K and Ladakh, they are residential schools facilities for nomadic children, and community involvement is also visible there. Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, Uttar Pradesh, they are talking about infrastructure. They are developing, they are creating infrastructure in schools so that to get more and more students in the school. Gujarat and Karnataka, they are taking initiatives to attendance assessment through Vidya Samiksha Kendra and student achievement tracking system. So way forward in action is monitor enrollment dropouts and retention at each level, each school level, and overall state and district level monitoring only gives average picture. So we'll have to review school buildings and requirements and improve GR and reduce dropout rates. For number of 0-6-year-old child to be left, no 0 to 6-year-old child to be left behind, that ratio we have already seen, and tap the brain development phase of every child up to age 6. That should be our plan way forward for access to education. This focus on learning recovery, clear-cut strategy we'll have to make, end-to-end tracking of every child from preschool to higher education through 100% student registry. That should be mainstream out of school children, and we'll have to identify infrastructural gaps. So community involvement through Vidyanjali, as you have mentioned, to augment the digital and physical infrastructure, and again to develop the capacity building. And Manodarpan initiative focus on mental and physical health and well-being of child. That is the main focus of national education policy also. Teachers as a transformer, again, major challenges are, we can see that the status of vacancies in academic post in all the state level and district level education institutes. Status of substandard teacher education institute, even we have, then also substandard teacher education institutes are there, then we cannot develop our own strategy. Teachers vacancies, you can see elementary level, most of the states don't have teachers, that is in high secondary level. And the most important, right to education compliant pupil-teacher ratio is also very problematic. Very sorry figures we can see. Single teacher schools still are running in remote areas in most of the states. That can be seen in this report. So poor quality programs and outcome and unavailability of trained teachers, most important factor which we can say that suboptimal teachers recruitment process, lack of individualization in training. So training is also very much important for teachers. And this talks about, that's why National Education Policy 2020 is very much important, because it is covering all the areas, instructions, flow of resources, teaching, goals, technology, policy, administration, and engagements. So innovative practices from states, again, for teachers, all the states are now in competition to take some innovative, to develop some strategies. Teachers as transformer, way forward. I will talk about review quality of teachers education institutions, because every time we are talking about major challenges, but need to focus on qualitative pre-services education to equip teachers with the capacity to implement new education policy. Strengthen in service teacher education, adopt professional standards for teachers and institutionalize mentoring. Recruitment to be based on projections, and provide tools to teachers for the purpose of self-appraisal. That should be in BRC, CRC, and DICE during consultations. And way forward for providing trained teachers to every school is the foremost responsibility of state and UT. Provide teachers resource for introducing innovative pedagogies by using technologies. Strong foundation for future readiness. Again, major challenges are, you can say, proficiency level in language and maths for all grades, as you have mentioned in your presentation also. Enrollment of children with preschools, you can say 57.5% of grade 1 children without preschool experience. Even you can see Karnataka, 10.32% percentage of children not having preschool experience. So ICT infrastructure is very much important with the labs, digital boards, electricity, internet. These are the, you are talking about library and sports material, but still these are the great luxury and facility for many of the schools in India. Gaps in coverage under vocational education. So future readiness, certain subjects, skills and capacity should be learned by all students to become good, successful, innovative, adaptable and productive human being. That is our topmost priority right now. So the new education policy is talking, main importance of skill for future readiness is foundational literacy and numeracy. Why? By creativity, scientific tempers, communications, health and nutrition, digital literacy. So again, innovative practices from states we can see in this report. I will skip that, but way forward, action to be taken by states again. So holistic learning, teach in mother tongue, track competencies, skill and abilities of every child, reduce curriculum, no silos between curricular areas and to between government department, and there should be multi-dimensional holistic assessment. Second is foundational learning, invest more in lower grades, reading is the key. So Nishta, train 100% teachers, Diksha, use available resources to augment digital and physical infrastructure in schools. Deeper and experimental learning leverages the potential of technology available. We have already seen that there are so many TV channels now while using innovative pedagogies, preparing, engaging high quality content in mother tongue, local, regional language for all digital modes. So peer learning, buddy system in Chandigarh and Navodaya Vidyalaya are the best examples when we can give example. Collaborative learning, institutionalized peer learning, group teamwork and collaborations. Skill-based learning, introducing and integrate certain skills and capacity in all grades, including IT and new age and industry skills. So this report is not only talking about the major problems, they are also talking about the way forwards. And priority areas for state UTs like foundational learning, skilling, and use of technology. So 100% energized textbooks with QR codes tagged to e-content. Mother tongue, that is the most important part of foundational learning. Regional language as medium of instruction. Performance grading index, you can see so many scores, like this is a tool designed to provide insight on the status of the school education in states and UTs, including key levers that drive their performance and critical areas of performance. So we can see the 36 parameters it has highlighted, and outcome and governance basis, learning outcome, access to education, infrastructure, equity, teacher education and training, and governance process, which I have already mentioned. And on the basis of the structure of state PGIs, we have seen scores of states, small states, big states, UTs, and states. So I stop here, where this report is giving us insight of all these scores. Thank you.
Thank you. This is going to be like a couple of comments in my understanding of India, and I'll try to frame it into a question. I feel like there is a lot of digital illiteracy in India, not infrastructural support in rural areas, access to digital devices, and cost of data in all the rural areas is very, very low, and the cost is very high for how much they make there. There's inadequate skills for people who live in those rural areas to access phones and technology-based products. There's a big language barrier. 85% of India does not speak English, but the phones are in English, essentially. So I feel like and I really appreciate everyone who's put in their thoughts. I feel like there's a big gap in what India needs and what everyone's talking about. The only solution I hear from each one of you is how everything should be digital. And you know, I'd never, besides Mr. Pavanji's presentation, there was a lot of talk about, you know, how there needs to be a foundational change in how schools are, you know, how there's a change in schools essentially. So also, like the previous session, there was Mr. Harshul, I think, or Hansul from Tech Mahindra, and he was talking about how they want to upskill people and how they want to make people skillful and not knowledgeable, and he essentially said that thing, and I feel like that's a disaster for India, because, you know, we don't want to upskill people, we want to educate people, and there's a huge difference. I'm going to quote a line from one of my favorite films, where a lion's going to jump on a chair every time you whistle, but that doesn't mean he's educated, that means he's well trained. So are we training people with digital, or are we making them educated? Because I feel like with this whole digital overtake in every field that we are seeing, I feel like we're training people, we're not educating people. An Uber driver knows how to use a phone in India, but he doesn't necessarily know what the slide means. He just knows that it's going to result in a functional change on his device, but he doesn't necessarily understand what it does. So do you think there should be any other change besides this huge overtake of digital? Because I feel like India is not ready for that. So digital or no? Because that's what all the startups here are doing.
Yeah, so I'll respond from our perspective as implementers. I actually don't think most foundational literacy programs are focused on digital. That's not true, actually. Most nonprofits that work in that space actually use hard copy books. we use much more than the digital space right now. Because as I was noting, most schools don't have access to computers. Most schools don't have access to the internet. So that's, I think, let me start with that point. Going further than that, we also have to be conscious of how the world is changing and what kinds of technology evolutions are happening. It's not always internet-based, and that's why we were talking a little bit about radio. In our portfolio, 70% of our kids have access to radio. So there were opportunities during the pandemic to have lessons through the radio with hard copy materials accessible to the child. There were opportunities to use the mobile device, but for things like parent support, like the nudging that Arundhati was talking about, where a parent who wasn't literate could get a video message on how to support their child to read at home. So I think many of us are very conscious of the fact that the children we're working with do not have access to digital technologies. So our first jump is not, especially during the pandemic period, it was very clear. You couldn't just access digital technologies as your solution. We had to take books out on camels, books out on boats, books out on tuk-tuks, right? Everything that we could to get into communities. And that's the reality. And infrastructure has to be seen for what it is, and you have to evolve with that. So I think on the foundational learning space, actually that's what most practitioners are saying. You don't want to miss the generation you have now looking for the generation that's going to have access to the internet in the future. And we say this a lot at Room to Read. In the history of the world, no one had trouble rebooting a book, right? So you can make sure a child is learning right now, right? We know how to teach reading. Most of my comments were about how to teach a child how to read and what a child needs. I don't know if others have comments on the technology space and sort of that evolution.
I didn't touch on it so much, because the panel's focused on that foundational numeracy and literacy, which is really focused in the young grades and in mother tongue and text. So that's sort of what we were talking about today. But I think as they get the foundation of the basic skills, right, those basic skills will help them throughout life and throughout the rest of their schooling. So one of the things that USAID is working on is we do a lot in the digital literacy space. I talked about the parents. It's really important. The parents don't have these skills either. So we're working with a lot of micro, small, and medium enterprises to also teach digital literacy, business management skills, business development skills. In turn, their children are also learning because we're promoting that sort of shared space, and we're introducing into educational systems digital literacy at higher grades. Yeah. We're just focused on the foundation today, but we're talking about digital literacy because, as we know, that's the future of the world, so it's extremely important. So it is an area where we're trying to look at. I visited school in Varanasi recently that was able, in the previous session, they talked about the CSR law, and those that aren't familiar, there's 2% of corporate social responsibility money that has to go back to communities. And I visited a school where we're doing the foundational learning, but they were able to tap into CSR funds to expand into solar rooftops, so their school is solar powered, and they have a whole computer lab, and we're able to get cell phones to start teaching digital literacy in that primary school. So that's happening, it needs to be documented and then scaled up, expanded and scaled up. But
I'd just add one point that I'd say, in fact, the scenario in Bangalore is that all of the edtech startups that very opportunistically jumped on digital, they've seen the biggest downturns in terms of valuation and users and all that. So that's not, if you just do it for the wrong reasons, that this is going to solve some problem without investing in the fundamental systems that it takes for problem solving, you're not going to see long-term change.
So at the cost of repetition, again, I'm mentioning that the basic framework for foundational literacy is educational infrastructure, access to education, basic health, learning outcomes, and governance. So basically, all those parameters are to be seen in a particular manner so that one can go through those scores which I'm talking about, like states have achieved.
So I think we have time for one more question. Go ahead. I see your hand.
Hi, I'm Dhaval, Stanford computer science alumni. I had a question with respect to your presentation, Pawan, and anybody else has thoughts, please share. So there must be some best practices that come out of your research with the states, right? All this work. Even Delhi government is doing some innovative stuff apparently, right? Sisodia is focused as an education minister also, one of his portfolio. So are there some exchanges of best practices, some partnership to learn from each other and do the best for India?
So on the basis of the presentation, I have seen best practice. I have shown best practices for school, for children, and for teachers transformation. So and you will see the scores also daily, particular on the basis of the 6 parameters. And the best thing is that all the states are competing with each other. It is not only about Delhi. Ladakh is learning from Karnataka, Karnataka is learning from Andhra, and Andhra is learning from Delhi. So it is not like that one particular framework is for then one particular state. It is like everybody is working for to achieve the foundational literacy.
Should we wrap up?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed our panel. There's a lot happening, as you can tell, in this space, and a lot of different perspectives on those that are working in this space. A lot to be done based on the scorecards that are coming out. But my only request, I guess, to all of you and anyone interested in education is let's not slow down. There's a lot that needs to be done. And thank you all so much for joining us. And I'll hand it back over to
Thank you.
Ahmed.
And if you could just stay here, I'll request Dr. DeBroy to make his comments
Sure.
on the session and the learnings from the report and his views on this and what does he think about it. So you have about 6 minutes.
Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there are issues connected with foundational learning, and there is the specific of this particular report. They overlap, but they're not quite the same. We've had a very rich discussion on issues connected with foundational learning. This is the second report that the Institute has done, the Institute for Competitiveness has done, for the Economic Advisory Council, which means that we are aware of what is in the report and have vetted it after a fashion. I should also quickly point out, because of what you said about digital and access to computers, that this report is very unusual. It does not presume the Economic Advisory Council has access to a computer, so the foreword is completely handwritten. When you look at a report like this, or if you're trying to write a report like this, essentially, you are trying to identify a set of variables. You're going to try to weight them, and then you're going to aggregate them into an index. And there is a data source you're going to use. The data source is pretty up to date, except the major data sources, all the data sources, are from right in the midst of the pandemic. So the pandemic was a shock. How that has affected the data sources and how that has affected the rankings, we don't know. We will have to wait and see. And this is the second time the Institute has done it, so presumably it will continue to do that in the future. In terms of including indicators, there is always some subjectivity. If this is foundational learning, and if I'm including infant mortality, should I include anemia amongst the mothers? Should I include institutional delivery? If I'm going to include expenditure on education, is that going to be irrespective of what that expenditure on education is on? For example, if there is a state which increases the wages and salaries of school teachers, does that lead to any improvement? In other words, there's always subjectivity in choosing the indicators. There is also subjectivity in choosing the weights and therefore in aggregating and getting the index. What is therefore important is to test for robustness and not get fixated on the rankings. Instead, you will find that all the states are in neat clusters. Within a certain cluster, whether a state is number 1 or number 2, it doesn't really matter. But quite clearly, there are certain clusters of states that are doing well and states that are not doing well. What is also important is with that constant methodology to track the improvement of a state over time. And because this is the second time the Institute has done it, you will find a page which is devoted to how a state has improved or has deteriorated over time. Foundational learning is only one part of the educational silo. So once we are talking about education, it's a moot question of how much I learn by just focusing on the foundational part of it. Should I actually separate it out, as someone has said, between the Anganwadi part of it and the primary, pre-primary part of it, because these are dealt with by separate units within the state government. But I thank the Institute for Competitiveness for having done this study. I hope they will continue to do this year after year so that we can not only get a snapshot of where states are at a certain point in time, but we can also gauge improvements over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.